Good evening again. If we can take our seats, you're more than welcome to grab, more drinks or hot chocolate. It seems like there's hot chocolate or water or desserts or anything else that you would like. But we'll begin tonight's event. Well, first of all, a very heartfelt welcome to all of you joining tonight in person and online. So welcome to our event. I see members from all the different communities of our school, some monastics, graduate and undergraduate students, and staff and faculty. So thank you. My name is Hansol Gu. I'm an assistant professor of liturgical theology in the School of Theology and Seminary here at St. John's. And I'm the director of Godfrey Diekmann Center. So Godfrey Diekmann Center was founded in honor of Father Godfrey Diekmann, who was a monk here at St. John's. He was one of the 42 theologians who participated in the liturgical renewal of the Second Vatican Council. He taught theology at St. John's University for 65 years, and the Diekmann Center seeks to honor his lifelong dedication to theology, liturgy, and the study of patristics by providing public lectures and other scholarly initiatives to contribute to the ongoing renewal of the liturgical life of the Church. To that end, I'm very honored to present the speaker for tonight's lecture, The Indigenous Origins of the Guadalupe Tradition, Dr. Timothy Matovina. Dr. Matovina is a professor in the theology department at the University of Notre Dame, where he taught for now 26 years. His most recent books include Theology of Guadalupe, From the Era of Conquest to Pope Francis, and Latino Catholicism, Transformation in America's Largest Church. He has two other forthcoming books. One is on the history, devotion, and theology of Guadalupe, will be published by Paulus Press. And the other one is on the 18th century Guadalupe sermons of Bartolome Felipe de Itaipara, the most influential Guadalupan preacher of the Spanish colonial era. In addition to his scholarly work, Dr. Matovina offers presentations and workshops on U.S. Catholicism and Latino ministry and theology throughout the United States. And most of all, Tim is a great mentor and a friend to so many that I know, including myself. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Timothy Matovina.
Thank you, Dr. Gu. It's great to be back here. It's an honor to be with you. The Diekmann Center is, I know a very important place, a very important man, so I'm glad to see she's breathing new life into it. And I'm glad to see that she's and so many other colleagues are thriving so well here. Thank you all for coming tonight. So I prepared a paper that I'm actually going to try to publish, but I'm not going to read the whole paper. It's kind of long, and that would be quite a bit. So I want to hopefully leave a good amount of time for question and answer. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to read the beginning of the paper because I want to make sure I get all the nuance in there. And the big middle of the paper, I'm going to summarize kind of briefly, just tell you what I won't give you all the details, but I'll tell you what the main points are. And then I'm going to also read the conclusion to the paper, because there I'm trying to tease out in more precise language exactly what the paper's all about. So here's goes. Catalina Mónica Juárez de Moisen was a native resident of Cuautitlan, the place traditionally considered the hometown of St. Juan Diego. She was reportedly 100 years old in 1666 when officials from the Cathedral chapter of Mexico City interviewed her for an inquiry to seek papal recognition and the promulgation of a liturgical feast day for Our Lady of Guadalupe. You need something? For the people that are, hello to the people who are watching us from afar. Well, welcome aboard. Testifying through Nahuatl Spanish interpreters, she stated that she learned of Juan Diego's encounters with Guadalupe from indigenous devotees of Cuautitlan, especially her parents, Diego and Maria Salome Juarez, as well as an aunt named Martina Salome, who Juarez de Moisen said knew Juan Diego and his family personally. This is a very important set of documents. This is the first woman to give any testimony at all about Guadalupe, and she was an indigenous woman. There were two indigenous women that were interviewed for this inquiry of the cathedral chapter in 1666. Elements of Juarez de Moisen's testimony echo details from the apparitions accounts and Guadalupe tradition that were already in circulation by the time of that capitular inquiry. Indeed, various details were contained in the interview questions that were posed to her. Nonetheless, she added information that was not specified or implied in the interviewer's questions, nor had been previously communicated in publications about Guadalupe or other extant sources. From a personal perspective, she recounted that from a young age, her parents and aunt initiated her into the family practice of visiting the Guadalupe Chapel at Tepeyac in present-day Mexico City, the site of Guadalupe's reported apparitions to Juan Diego. In particular, she recalled participating in the practice of Cuautitlan residents processing annually with candles and roses to offer prayers at Tepeyac the day after Guadalupe's feast. She also recalled the physical structures at Tepeyac from her younger days, such as some planks that visitors had to cross over a stream at a time before a stone bridge was constructed. Moreover, and this is maybe the most important, like other indigenous witnesses from Cuautitlan, she related her family memory of indigenous devotees who, quote, asked Juan Diego to intercede for them with she who is the Queen of Heaven and the Mother of God. While clergy had previously invoked Juan Diego as a model of virtue, especially for indigenous Christians, Juarez de Moisen and her Cuautitlan companions were the very first to testify that native peoples turned to Juan Diego as an intercessor with Our Lady of Guadalupe. The testimony of Juarez de Moisen suggests there was indigenous involvement in the Guadalupe tradition since its very inception. Yet the extent of their involvement is debated. Some scholars have overstated the case with assertions that Guadalupe, quote, her early cult was overwhelmingly Indian, or that she, quote, unified Indians in a single religious movement. Conversely, others have contended that native participation was negligible, even claiming that, also quoting, it was not until the 18th century that the Indians began to seek refuge under the shadow of the Virgin of Tepeyac. The most controversial element of this debate is the dating and authorship of the Nican Mapoa, a title derived from the document's first words, which mean, here is recounted. This is the Nahuatl language account of the Guadalupe apparitions. Widely acclaimed as the foundational text of the Guadalupe tradition, the Nican Mapoa narrates the apparitions to Juan Diego, his proclamation of Guadalupe's message to Bishop Juan de Zumárraga, and the bishop's eventual consent to dedicate a chapel to her on the hill of Tepeyac after Juan Diego presented him the sign of flowers that grew out of season, and the image of Guadalupe miraculously appeared on his tilma, or cloak. There is a similar debate with regard to the Nahuatl language document Inan Hui Tuamasweltica, which means this is the great marvel, also known as the Relación Primitiva, or the primitive relation. A shorter account of the apparitions, parallel in content to the Nican Mapoa, though it does not mention Juan Diego nor Juan de Zumárraga by name. It goes without saying that these ancient documents posit a central indigenous role in the origins of Guadalupan devotion through the person of Juan Diego. Nonetheless, whatever one's historical judgment regarding the dating and authorship of these critical primary documents, it is important to note that in the 16th century, there was no citation or reference to either of them in known sources, much less widespread dissemination of their written contents. Nor is it possible to ascertain precisely the contents and timeline of oral traditions about Juan Diego among indigenous and other devotees. Indeed, the bulk of the earliest extant primary sources, the most descriptive of which are examined below in this essay, focus more on Guadalupean devotion among indigenous and Spanish believers, not on the Nican Mapoa, the Inanhuituama Huitzoltica, or other accounts of Juan Diego's encounters with Guadalupe. So the early documentation, which is not that great, talks about devotion at Tepeyac, not about Juan Diego's apparitions, encounters with Guadalupe. That's what most of the documents talk about. And I'm not going to go all over it, but that's what the body of this paper basically summarizes those documents. Scholars from all sides of the debate about the genesis of the Guadalupe tradition tend to give insufficient attention to a crucial insight. This is a very core point for examining this evidence. In the 16th century, Guadalupe was a decidedly local tradition and devotion within the environs of Mexico City. Now, this is a key point. Anybody who knows anything about Guadalupe knows she is kinetic in Mexico today. In Mexico, they say, no matter if you're an atheist, no matter who you are, you're a Guadalupano. So we cannot anachronistically read the current popularity of Guadalupe back into the 16th century. That's a key point for trying to analyze what was the indigenous involvement. It was a small chapel on a hill, as I'll go on to say. And so you got to keep that in mind as you assess all of the evidence. For nearly a century after the reported 1531 date of the Guadalupe apparitions, the central place of worship at the Guadalupe Shrine at Tepeyac was an occasionally enlarged, but still relatively modest chapel. It was a chapel on the hill on the edge of town. Moreover, there were no other known churches, altars, convents, schools, or institutions named for Guadalupe in nearby Mexico City or beyond during the entire 16th century. The construction of the first church edifice dedicated to Guadalupe beyond the vicinity of Tepeyac, for example, did not begin until 1654 in San Luis Potosí, about 250 miles north of Mexico City. Nor is there any evidence until the 17th century of feast day celebrations beyond the Tepeyac locality, published sermons dedicated to her, or reproductions of the Guadalupe image. These are all the things that an historian normally looks for to see a devotion growing, and they just simply don't exist in the 16th century that we know of. In this context of a still evolving local tradition, it is not surprising that extant records indicate a relatively circumscribed indigenous participation, since the participation of Spanish and other devotees was also not yet widespread. So it's not just the natives, the devotion is local among all the groups. To understand the indigenous influence on the formative stages of the Guadalupe tradition, then, we need to examine the gradual rise of this local tradition, its devotional expressions, miraculous manifestations, visual representations, appeal to diverse castes, and the like, within the broader context of the patterns of continuity and change that mark the sacred landscape of New Spain. Within that broader context, native devotees who visited the chapel at Tepeyac, along with those who lived in the indigenous community around it and in the community of Cuautitlan, where Juan Diego was from, these native peoples shaped early Guadalupean devotion in tandem with their Spanish counterparts. Their foundational influence is essential for understanding the origins of the Guadalupe tradition. It is also a critical starting point for examining subsequent developments in Guadalupean devotion, as well as the meaning and significance of Guadalupe across diverse eras and communities down to the present. Okay, that's the introduction. Now there's three parts to the talk. The first one is just a demonstration that this was indeed only a local tradition. And again, that might seem like a simple point, it is, but very few people recognize this, and many people deny it, even though I think the evidence is overwhelming. So I go through and point out the kinds of devotion, the fact that there wasn't any other churches or chapels dedicated to her, the fact that in Mexico City alone, there were 55 miraculous images of the Virgin Mary in the colonial era. To go back and think Guadalupe had already captured the hearts of all of Mexico is just a huge anachronism. There's almost 500 known miraculous images of Christ, Mary, and the saints in colonial Mexico. So Guadalupe starts out as a little devotion that's one among many. And of course, again, we have to try to take ourselves back into the life and devotion of the people of that time. Here we think miracles are unusual things. Maybe we shouldn't, Miracle is not something that science can't explain. In Christianity, miracle is anything that causes us to wonder and see the presence of God in daily life. So there are miracles all over the place. But they had that mentality back in those times. Our Lady of Remedios, a Spanish image of the Virgin Mary, who Hernan Cortés, the conqueror of Mexico, brought over with him, she had a huge shrine near Mexico City, 10 miles from the cathedral. And in times of epidemic, in times of other diseases, in times of foreign attack, they actually called more on Remedios than Guadalupe in the 16th century for divine aid, for celestial aid. So Guadalupe is there, and she's starting to grow, but it's still a decidedly local devotion. And that's a key point for understanding everything else that I'm going to say. I threw a few slides in here just to give you oops, I don't know where they went, though. Oh, there it is. That's the first one, right? Yeah, okay, that's it. So this is, one of the items that I comment on in that first section of the paper. This is an engraving of, it was used for fundraising for the first big church they actually built at Tepeyac. It's no longer there. If you go there, you can see the old basilica. This was for the church, not the original chapel, but the church that was built after that was subsequently taken down, and the old basilica is there now. So this church was completed and dedicated in 1622, and they were raising money. They made this like a holy card. So you see Guadalupe in the middle, and on the panels on the left and the right sides, there are 4 panels on either side, 8 panels in total. And each of those panels, if you can look at it more closely, if you could hold the card in your hand, you could see it better, is a miracle that she worked, like from ex votos that were left at the shrine. So people, it's like any medieval shrine, early modern shrine, people gather miracle stories, and there's books of miracles. This is an early kind of a visual manifestation of that. So presumably, some of the first miracles attributed to Guadalupe brought together on one holy card. And why did Guadalupe devotion start to grow? Like any Catholic site, people went there, they said they felt her presence, they said they prayed and their prayers were answered. Fame starts to grow. How does any Lourdes, Fatima, any famous site, how does it grow? Claims of divine interventions and graces that are given at the shrine. So that's one of the ways I outline in this first section of the paper how the devotion is slowly beginning to grow. Not surprising at all. It also appealed, one of the things that did bring Guadalupe eventually to be the most important religious image in all of Mexico, is it appealed to multiple castes. And you see here, it's a beautiful painting, the royalty of the Nahuatl people, the Aztec people on the left, the royalty of Spain, gathered at the font of baptism with Guadalupe overseeing as the mother of the church their evangelization. So the fact that from the beginning, it wasn't a Spanish devotion, and it wasn't a native devotion. It was a devotion that spoke to both groups and eventually to the various castas, the mixing of races in Mexico. Africans that came in, people that were mixed races between all these groups, they all found a devotion in Guadalupe. They all started pious societies, cofradías, that were dedicated to Guadalupe. And so her appeal, because she is a brown-skinned native person of the land, her appeal to all the castes also became part of that process by which the devotion grew and eventually became kind of permeating all of Mexico. Oops, I don't know what I'm touching that does that. All right, part 2 of the paper. What was the shape of early indigenous devotion? And so what I do in this section is I just kind of point out all the texts and all the evidence we have that show that from the very beginning, natives were involved. Now, some have argued, as I said in the beginning there, that they didn't have much involvement at all because they say, look, there's only there's only a couple dozen references. Well, the fact of the matter is there's only a couple dozen references to Spanish devotion as well. So, and those tend to be a little bit more descriptive, but don't forget, Spaniards are writing all these things. And this is taking place, Tepeyac, if you go to Guadalupe Shrine now, it's in Mexico City. But it wasn't in Mexico City then. It was 3 miles. The city's grown in the last 500 years. It was on the edge of town, in the outskirts. And the fact that Spaniards said anything at all about indigenous devotion is is kind of a tip of the iceberg. If you're a social historian, women, native peoples, enslaved peoples, they don't get written up in the documents that the powerful people write usually. So the fact that we have these documents, and a few of them are written by indigenous sources, so we begin to discern that, yes, there was a Spanish devotion, but there was an indigenous devotion growing up simultaneously from the beginning. And I won't go over all the documents, but there's even testimony that the natives not only were participating, they were developing their own practices, their own devotional expressions to Guadalupe. So you see things like the use of drums and dance and native chants that are becoming part of the Guadalupan devotion, sometimes when natives are celebrating alone, sometimes when they're celebrating with the whole populace. By the early 17th century, there's clear evidence that with segregated society, there was a week of fiestas, of celebrations for the Guadalupe feast for the natives, and then a separate week for the Spaniards and the castas. So there are various ways that we see the natives are beginning not only to participate, but are developing their own devotions and their own, we can't really tell very deeply what did it mean to them. There's not a lot of documents that express that. But we see that they're participating, very gainfully in this, along with, they're not the only ones, but they are participating kind of on an equal basis with Spaniards and then the other groups. A miracle account that I showed you a moment ago, called the Stradamus engraving with the 8 miracles, none of those depict an indigenous person being healed, which has led some interpreters to say, you see, the natives weren't participating. But that's a very weak historical argument. That holy card was used to raise money from rich donors. So that's why it largely has Spanish people being healed. When you read, there are 3 books of miracles, so to speak, that picture that I showed you, and 2 written accounts of miracles. And the written accounts of the miracles, both of them have accounts of those 8 stories that are depicted in that holy card. And then they add other stories. And almost all the stories they add are indigenous healings, as if to say, the indigenous were here too, don't trust what's in that card. And this is a painting of what's called El Primer Milagro, the first miracle of Guadalupe. Well, the first miracle, of course, is the apparitions to Juan Diego, the healing of, this is the first miracle after the apparition, so to speak. So what you see here, you see up there in the upper right, that's actually what it looked like back in those days. If you go to Mexico now, you go to a place called Xochimilco. You can ride on the canals. And Mexico was an island in the middle of a lagoon, a lake. It had 4 bridges going out to the causeways, and people traveled like in Venice by boats. So what you see there, that bridge, is the causeway leading from downtown Mexico City, where the cathedral is now, 3 miles out to the land on the other side, which is where Tepeyac was. And you see there's a procession going with all the dignitaries, the bishop and everyone of town, carrying the image from the bishop's oratory out to Tepeyac, where the first chapel had been built. And then you see natives are floating in their boats and all that, because they participated, as the story goes, in this procession. In the fuller picture, you see down here a native in the lower left-hand side there with an arrow. The story of the first miracle is that the natives would shoot arrows off as a kind of a form of recreation, The Spaniards did this too. They reenacted the battles between the Spaniards and the Moors in the reconquest of Spain. So this was something that they did on feast day celebrations. And according to the story, one of the natives was accidentally struck with an arrow. There was no violence going on, but it was an accident. And so he died. And they took him before the image of Guadalupe in the new chapel of Guadalupe, and he was healed. So this is one of those early signs that the indigenous were there and they were as involved as anybody else. All right, let me go on to the third point now, which is the communities of Tepeyac and Cuautitlan. Cuautitlan, again, is the hometown of Juan Diego. This is maybe the part of the paper I'm proudest about, because I did a lot of digging to find this stuff out. Tepeyac is the place where the Guadalupe Shrine is to this day. There are, no one had noticed this before, but I noticed this in my research. There are 4 independent accounts, independent of one another, from the 16th century, all of which say the same thing. The only people living at Tepeyac, where this little chapel was, were native people, and the chaplain, who of course was not a native person, the priest. So for all of the 16th century, as this burgeoning devotion is beginning to grow, the only people who actually live there are native peoples. There's an account of, it's not till the early 17th century, but the first cloistered Spanish sisters to go and found a convent in the Far East. They went to the Philippines. They pass through and they stop at Tepeyac. A lot of people did that. By then there was little houses that when the church was being built, that big church I talked about, there were little houses, casas de novenarios. If you went there for a novena, they had like guest houses where you could stay. And the sisters stayed at that guest house. And they met some of these elderly women who were sort of the caretakers of the shrine, who told them the story of, the Virgin appeared here to an Indian. She imprinted her image on his cloak. It was the first kind of written account we have, or first oral account of someone telling the story. At any rate, these natives lived at Tepeyac, and we don't have a lot of details about what they did. By tradition, it's been said in various sources that Juan Diego lived at Tepeyac too, until he died, and was one of the native community that was there as a caretaker. What they did is somewhat shrouded in mystery. We don't have a lot of details. But one thing is certain. The only people living there were natives. The Spaniards who lived in downtown, near headquarters, near where the government was, near where the cathedral was, they had an early tradition. On Sunday, they would walk out the 3 miles and go offer prayers, go to Mass, make a confession at the chapel. By the mid-16th century, one of the archbishops actually built 15 chapels on the way out towards Tepeyac, 15 little kind of chapels, so you could pray the 15 mysteries of the Rosary on your morning, afternoon walk. And it was a Sunday activity for the Spaniards. But when they got to Tepeyac, the people that lived there on a day-to-day basis were the natives. So that's another kind of little piece of that. The natives were actually very present and involved in how this was formulating. The Cuautitlan part of my paper, I read at the very beginning about this woman, Catalina Suarez. She was one of 8 witnesses from Cuautitlan who, when they did this inquiry to try to get the Pope to name the feast day, it didn't work, by the way. The Pope didn't do that to the following century. The Pope that they thought was going to do it in the 17th century, he died before the things was completed, and the next Pope just didn't pay attention to it, so it took them another century to get it to happen. But we have the testimonies. So we have the testimonies of 8 indigenous people. And again, many people have discounted these testimonies because, what happened was you had it was like the Inquisition. People would be brought into a room, one native at a time. There'd be 8 or 9 priests. They'd light candles. They'd make you swear on a Bible to tell the truth, and it would be very intimidating. And on top of that, the natives were speaking through an interpreter. Then they would ask them the questions, and we have the questions. They're in the documentation of this inquiry, and they would ask questions like this: Are you aware that on December 9th, 1531, Juan Diego was going to catechism, and they tell basically the whole story. The question goes on for 3 pages, and the native person listens and listens, and the response that's given in the documentation is yes, see. So everything that they were supposed to testify to is given in the question. So a number of historians have rightly said, this is not of much use. There was an intimidating environment. The answers are given in the questions. The fact that the natives said they knew about this doesn't really tell us much. So what I did is I went back to the original and I underlined everything, and it's several hundred pages. I underlined everything that every witness said, the Spanish witnesses who were mostly priests, Criollo witnesses who were priests in Mexico City, the 8 people from Cuautitlan who were all lay people, and I underlined everything they said that was not contained in the questions. And if you ever interviewed anybody, if you've ever done any oral interviews, you know about this. And native peoples, or I've done a lot of interviews in Spanish, people will tell you what they think you want to hear. And then they'll say, well, let me tell you something else, And then they start going off spontaneously. And those little spontaneous sharings are the most interesting ones, because these are the things that are being self-generated. So I made a study of everything the natives said that was unique to them, that had not been said before in any published sermon or book about Guadalupe, and that was not said by any of the witnesses who were non-native in this. And I compiled all of that to sort of say, this is the initial oral testimony of the natives. And there's various things in there. Not a whole lot, but they talked about this Franciscan friar, Pedro de Gante, who is not mentioned anywhere else in any Guadalupe documentation, but was beloved by the natives because he was a friar who learned their language and really loved and cared for them. And so it's striking that they said that when they were growing up in the parish in Cuautitlan, where Juan Diego was from, that they had paintings of Pedro de Gante and Juan Diego and his uncle Juan Bernardino, who Our Lady Guadalupe healed. So they were making that association according to this memory of theirs early on, that Guadalupe is among these people who came here not to destroy our way of life, but to uplift it, like Friar de Gante did with the gospel. They spoke about, various other elements of their devotion. The most striking thing, and I want to read this part of the paper to you, the most striking thing was that they said, a number of the native witnesses, the majority said, in various ways, we would go to Tepeyac to pray, like Catalina Juarez said, I read yours, and we would ask Juan Diego to pray to us to Our Lady, because he had a special relation. Now, of course, these people didn't personally experience that. They're quoting aunts and uncles and grandparents who told them these stories. And almost every one of them said, the way I learned about Our Lady of Guadalupe was from my aunt, from my godmother, from my grandmother, from my tío. These are so they presented it very much as a family devotion. And you can walk from Cuautitlan to Tepeyac. They all describe themselves as having made that pilgrimage, that journey. But they were the first to talk about Juan Diego as an intercessor and as a saint. We have a wonderful student at Notre Dame right now whose doctoral dissertation is about the canonization of Juan Diego. It's going to be excellent because he's studying early modern changes in the practices of canonization and how eventually this process came to be. Spaniards, of course, at this time would not have conceived of Juan Diego as being a saint. I mean, the Spaniards back in Europe, they didn't even want to canonize, people of Spanish descent born in the New World. St. Rose of Lima was finally canonized, but there was a big to-do before they finally could get, quote-unquote, an American saint. It was a lot of work. And to canonize a native person, out of the question. But the natives themselves were already acting as if Juan Diego was a holy figure, teaching them the faith, and an intercessor. So let me show you these last couple slides. This is the first freestanding picture of Juan Diego. There are earlier paintings where he's in the painting but it's a painting of Our Lady, and Juan Diego is there interacting with her. This is the first one where he's the subject of the painting. It was the one used in the canonization eventually. And you see him, he hears the beautiful birds singing. That's what called him. He heard beautiful music. That's what called him to the hill of Tepeyac. You see he's carrying a staff. Oh, by the way, those natives from Cuautitlan, several of them said, when Juan Diego was alive, we called him El Peregrino, the pilgrim, because he would make long pilgrimages to go to catechism class at the famous Franciscan Catechetical Center, or to Tepeyac before he finally lived there. So he's dressed in pilgrim dress, he's carrying a pilgrim staff, and you see Our Lady's at the top of the hill, he's going to the top of the hill. So this is one of the first paintings. It's not done by an indigenous person, it's done by a Criollo painter, but it carries the spirituality of the native people that I'm talking about. They were already the first to name Juan Diego as a holy figure and an intercessor. And again, that's key. This is native, everyday, grassroots believers shaping the theology of Juan Diego and Guadalupe from the very beginning. So it's kind of a small point, but I'm trying to show you it's actually a very, very big point. Theology is not just happening by the priests in the cathedral who are writing the wonderful books about Guadalupe, which are also about to be written. The natives themselves are beginning to shape the entire tradition. I got to show you this last one too, one of my favorites. They continue to shape it to this day, of course. The identification of Mexican people with Juan Diego is very, very powerful. What I'm going to read you now is the final paragraph of section 3. And then I'm going to read the conclusion to the essay so you can see how I brought this all together. Excuse me. Most importantly from the testimonies of the 8 people from Cuautitlan in the 1606 capitular inquiry. Most importantly, echoing in incidents conveyed in the books of Miguel Sanchez and Luis Lasso de la Vega, the first 2 priests to write books about Guadalupe, various informants confirmed that Juan Diego resided and served at the Guadalupe Chapel after the apparitions. But, like Catalina Mónica Juárez de Moisén, multiple Cuautitlan witnesses further attested that their relatives and friends visited Juan Diego at Tepeyac to ask that he intercede for them. 4 of these witnesses specified that they particularly asked Juan Diego to bless their agricultural pursuits, suggesting an intercessory relation akin to that of a patron saint perceived to be an advocate for a particular need. So they were already acting like he's the patron saint of our cornfields, of our maize fields. In the words of Gabriel Juarez, one of these witnesses, they approached Juan Diego, quote, to ask that he intercede for them with the Most Holy Virgin to give them good seasons or harvests in their maize fields. The absence of references to existing devotion to Juan Diego as an intercessor in other sources, including the books of Sanchez, Lasso de la Vega, and all the Mexico City witnesses in the capitular inquiry, reveals that native witnesses spoke of a devotion to Juan Diego generated among their own communities, not one borrowed from Spanish or Criollo informants. Indigenous devotees were the first to engage Juan Diego both as a model of sanctity and as an intercessor. All right, now the conclusion. Indigenous origins of the Guadalupe tradition. Guadalupe, this will echo some things that I didn't treat entirely here, but I hope it gives you a deeper insight to what's pieces I skipped in the middle of this. Guadalupe was undoubtedly a paradoxical figure for indigenous devotees. She was a powerful mother and intercessor, a brown-skinned woman like them who provided continuity with an ancient Nahuatl worship site. Her chapel shrine was located in an indigenous community and attracted native devotees from the surrounding area. She favored one of their own, Juan Diego, and worked miracles that to some extent alleviated the suffering of supplicants amidst the devastating effects of conquest and European diseases. But she was also a force whom Spaniards engaged to enhance native peoples' acceptance of colonial rule and missionary efforts, a protagonist in the Spanish efforts to displace indigenous ways. From community to community, and even from person to person, natives adapted Spanish Catholic practices in the symbolic world they mediated in accordance with their own life situations. Their participation in Guadalupan devotion was part of their larger effort to accommodate themselves to their changing circumstances in the wake of the Spanish conquest. Extant primary sources such as wills, reports of miracles, documents that reference processions and rituals at Tepeyac indicate that indigenous devotees venerated Guadalupe in tandem with their Spanish counterparts, and eventually with the Criollo and other caste groups that emerged, though for over a century the practice of Guadalupan devotion was largely confined to the local environs of Mexico City. Moreover, devotional expressions that were rooted in the natives' indigenous heritage, such as drum beats, song, and dance, along with their separate processions and feast day celebrations, reveal natives made distinct contributions to the advent of Guadalupan devotion. They also comprised the community that lived around Tepeyac, the only local residents on hand to provide everyday care for the site of the Guadalupe Chapel and for the devotees who visited it. The Cuautitlan witnesses for the 1666 capitular inquiry further revealed native contributions to the evolving Guadalupe tradition. They underscored that Guadalupe was not only a healing and an apparitions tradition, but also a familial and communal tradition of faith into which their elders had initiated them. No one else was saying that. All the Spanish priests were saying, she's about healing, this is apparitions, it's a miracle, the Catholic faith is arriving. The natives talked about the family meaning, the local traditional meaning of Guadalupe. The natives were also the first to connect Juan Diego and Juan Bernardino to Pedro de Gante, a Franciscan friar who, like Guadalupe, is remembered for the compassion and the dignity with which he treated natives. And the natives were the first to honor Juan Diego both as an exemplar of holiness and as an intercessor, particularly for harvests that were essential for their sustenance. The Guadalupe tradition was clearly founded on Catholic Marian antecedents from Spain, but natives also shaped its devotional expressions and its meanings in multiple ways. While the evidence is not conclusive, native influences necessitate considering their impact on belief in Juan Diego's encounters with Guadalupe, the apparitions. Many commentators on Miguel Sanchez's Imagen de la Virgen María, his book which presented the first published account of the apparitions, have bemoaned that Father Sanchez did not cite documentary sources for the apparitions narrative he recounted. Sanchez himself offered a reference to oral sources, stating that in conducting research for his volume, he could not locate any written sources, so he, quote, appealed to the providential curiosity of the elderly, in which I found some sufficient for the truth. His statement could refer to indigenous informants, such as the Cuautitlan witnesses to the subsequent capitular inquiry, but it's too vague to tell for sure. However, the fact that Sanchez presented the indigenous neophyte Juan Diego as the protagonist in the apparitions narrative suggests that his elderly sources may have been natives who passed on their communal oral testimony about Juan Diego. This is another one of the kind of the historical mysteries it's hard to unpack. Some people have said Miguel Sanchez, the priest who wrote the first published account of the apparitions, he did it to glorify the criollos, the people of Spanish blood born in the New World. There's whole books written on this. And I've asked all of those people at conferences and that, if he invented the story to build up Criollo patriotism and Criollo dignity, why did he make the person who saw Our Lady an indigenous person? Why would a Criollo nationalist do that? My answer is he did what he wasn't lying. He said he heard this story as an oral history and he wrote it down. And what he heard was it was an indigenous person who was the recipient of this encounters with Guadalupe. But that's another kind of big bones of contention. But ask yourself that. Why does this Criollo priest write about an indigenous person being the protagonist? Here's my answer. Whatever the sources Sanchez employed, it is not surprising that indigenous devotees were the first to venerate and seek the intercession of the unanticipated hero Juan Diego, both because he was one of their own and because Spaniards and Criollos did not tend to hold the natives in high regard. As a number of commentators have observed, at its core, the apparition story is neither about Spanish election nor about Criollo election, but about Guadalupe's providential choosing of a native person as her emissary. These commentators point out, for example, the dramatic reversals effected in the course of the apparitions narrative, such as Juan Diego's transformation from a sense of his inferiority to the dignity of serving as Guadalupe's messenger, Bishop Zumárraga's changing attitude toward Juan Diego from initial suspicion to confidence, and the shifting geographic focus from the bishop's residence in the capital city, where Juan Diego had to go to see the bishop, to the indigenous settlement on the peripheries in Tepeyac, where in the end the bishop and his entourage accompany Juan Diego to dedicate the temple that Guadalupe requested. When coupled with the evidence for early native devotion to Juan Diego and their testimonies about him, his leading role in the apparitions narrative intimates that natives participated in the development of a local devotion encompassing an oral tradition about a saintly indigenous figure whose experiences, mystical experiences, of Guadalupe eventually were codified and elevated to foundational status through through the publications of Sanchez and Las de la Vega. That's my big argument. All the evidence I presented, the natives had started this devotion in tandem with the Spaniards. They were the ones that were speaking of Juan Diego as saint, as intercessor. They also had certain ways that they were talking about his encounters with Guadalupe. That was their oral tradition that eventually becomes codified in the writings, which happens in many Marian and other apparition shrines. There's local stories, and eventually the more institutional church has to kind of standardize it. So it's got a canonical kind of a manifestation. That's what I see happening here. And it's actually not surprising. That's what happens. But no one else has been arguing this about the Guadalupe story and how the tradition came to be. My conclusion, of course, leaves various questions unanswered, not the least of which is a precise timeline for the origin and development of the apparitions tradition. But it's consistent with Sanchez's claim that his sources for his apparition story were local informants and oral tradition, as well as with the tendency for accommodation and the interweaving of religious traditions between natives and Spaniards. All right, final couple comments here. These last comments are like, what difference does all of this make? If I'm right historically, what difference does it make? So this is the big conclusion now. Drum roll. Okay, here we go. Recognizing the indigenous influence on the origins of the Guadalupe tradition is not only important for the accuracy of the historical record, but also for illuminating the meanings and significance of Guadalupe down to our very day. Guadalupan studies have tended to focus on the origins of her cult rather than its evolution, particularly the historicity of the apparitions account as evidenced in the long-standing debates about the dating and authorship of the Nican Mapoa. Most books about Guadalupe are the ongoing argument. Did the apparitions occur? What can we know? What can we not know? This has been going on since the late 18th century, and there's a library full of books about this. So I'm saying we should start looking at some other things. I'm not the only one that's doing that, but I think it's an important thing. Many scholars focus on Guadalupe as a foundational event, even those who are very in favor of this tradition. They focus on it as a foundational event whose meaning is given in its origins and is largely unchanging. However, Guadalupe is not a single event, but rather a series of events, and the ways those events were narrated, understood, and formed into a living tradition. Professor Gu's got her class here. I had a wonderful chance to visit with them today. For those of you who are from that class, this is exactly what we were talking about in class today. What's the difference between tradition and, in Yves Congar's rendering, traditioning? How does something become not just a tradition, as in kind of a custom or a practice, but a living way that a way of life and a life of faith is passed on? And that's the way I'm studying Guadalupe here. Not as some event that we can dissect scientifically and try to pinpoint, but as a series of events in the 16th century that give rise to a faith tradition that's passed on in these native communities and others as well. Like the gospel accounts of Jesus' resurrection appearances, which do not proclaim a sudden eruption of mass conversions, as some say happened with Guadalupe, do not proclaim a sudden eruption of mass conversions, but a series of transformative encounters that catalyzed a global faith tradition. The foundational encounters of native and other devotees with Guadalupe set in motion a local tradition that in time became an international phenomenon. In seeking the origins of the Guadalupe tradition, then, we are not merely looking for the moment in which it all began, but the processes through which the tradition was born and became incarnate in the hearts and minds of believers. The indigenous origins of the Guadalupe tradition were an integral part of these processes. The subsequent evolution of Guadalupan devotion and theologies further demonstrates the need to examine the relationship between Guadalupe and her faithful as a living tradition of faith. In broad strokes, after the Guadalupe tradition was established locally at Tepeyac and in Mexico City and the environs during the 16th century, Guadalupe grew to regional prominence in the 17th century, became the patroness of the entire Viceroyalty of New Spain in the 18th century, was acclaimed as the national symbol of the newly formed Mexican nation in the 19th century, and evolved into an international devotion in the 20th and 21st centuries. At the same time, theologians and preachers in each successive epoch since the mid-17th century have plumbed the meaning of Guadalupe for their times. Contemplating the Guadalupe image, the narrative of her apparitions to Juan Diego, testimonies of her miracles and her faithful's devotion, these theologians sought to unveil the deeper meanings and significance of Guadalupe. The long-standing focus on the 16th century in scholarship and popular understanding has obscured later developments that are equally crucial for the development of Guadalupean devotion and for understanding Guadalupe's message and significance in the lives of her faithful. As we approach the quincentenary of the Guadalupe tradition in 2031, we're about to have 500 years of Guadalupe in 6 more years, the distinct contributions of early indigenous devotees accentuate the need to explore the breadth of the Guadalupe tradition in order to discern more profoundly its inner core. Thank you. This is another Guadalupe miracle. I finished on time tonight. It almost never happens. So we do have time for some questions, and I've got some questions that people sent in that I can refer to, but maybe someone has an immediate question based on something that you just heard or another thought that you want to raise.
Well, thank you for an excellent talk, and it's really inspiring to hear how it was indigenous people who were so proactive. I was wondering if you have any intuitions or hunches, or maybe your research shows, how much did the indigenous people develop their tradition around this really from their, the Christian catechesis and what they learned about the Blessed Virgin Mary in the Catholic tradition? Or how much did they baptize pre-Christian beliefs they had about goddesses or other things?
Thank you. That is a point that I treat in the body that I didn't read, and it's a very important question. My answer is there are those who say Christianity wiped out indigenous memory and kind of replaced it, There are those who say, on the other hand, to me, they're two extremes. Christianity was merely a thin veneer over what were ongoing indigenous practices. These two approaches are not just for Guadalupe, any kind of group that's been evangelized, even the Germanic peoples back in the days, My answer is neither one of those is correct. What happened was, and this is not just Guadalupe, you can see this throughout, I think, Latin America, native peoples had to accommodate to a new force that had come into their lives. And so they developed what I would call Nahuatl Christianity. They embraced Christianity, but enculturated, indoctrinated in some ways on their own terms. They resisted certain things. We have to bear in mind several factors in the 16th century. For example, again, there's often claims that with Guadalupe, all the natives were baptized. It's just simply not true. The basic dynamic of the 16th century was not mass baptism, although millions of natives were baptized. The basic dynamic was mass death. European diseases wiped out probably as many as 90% of the native peoples who lived in the Valley of Mexico. What were these people thinking when they prayed to Guadalupe? This is COVID on steroids. So I don't know what was going on in native communities, but it's impossible to meditate on what was going on without thinking about the mass death. I suspect a number of them embraced Guadalupe because the Spaniards embraced her and they weren't dying from the diseases. So maybe, as often happened in other places where they evangelized native peoples and the natives died of the European diseases that were brought over through no one's intention or fault, they would embrace Catholicism because it looked like a religion that worked. The natives also, by the third generation, just think of immigrants. All of us have some immigrant background for the most part, I think. The first generation of the conquest, they knew pre-conquest religion. Those born after the conquest only knew what their elders told them. Those born, the grandchildren of those, they knew Spanish colonial society and all the churches around them. So, historical memory doesn't fade entirely, But when you get to the point where there's no living person who has a living memory of the pre-conquest times, it's harder to continue to hold on to that. So I think Guadalupe was not the only way this was going on. There are a number of books about marriage practices, baptism, and other things that natives were embracing. But Guadalupe was part of this larger process where the Nahuas we're not going to beat them, so we're going to join them. They're accepting Christianity, but they're also shaping Christianity. And of course, that's the process of enculturation that Professor Gu teaches here. It's not a one-way street. Enculturation is not, we bring the gospel and we throw a serape on the altar and say, there, we've enculturated the liturgy now. The native culture also helps us to deepen our understanding of our Christian mysteries. So this mutual exchange is going on. That's what I think is going on with Guadalupe.
Thank you very much for all of this. My wife and I had our 25th wedding anniversary last May, and we went to Mexico City.
Congratulations.
And when we were packing, my wife looked at my pile, and on the top was your book. And she gave me a weird look, like, what, are you going to write an article while we're on vacation? Anyway, I'm a New Testament scholar, and I'm really struck by sort of the parallel between how you've talked about this tradition and sort of what we find with Scripture, about how really it's almost always impossible to find the historical core. There's a great line by a scholar who says, biblical texts are not objects, they're objectiles, which I think is a nice way of what you're trying to describe. Anyway, my question is really, I'd appreciate if you could help me think through how to talk to lay people, sometimes students, for whom holding on to some historical core is really important, because that's sometimes, what you've described is so theologically rich, but there are a lot of people who really struggle with the ability to sort of let that historical question go. So I'm just curious if you have any insight about that.
Yeah, thank you for that. And since you're a biblical scholar, I'd say the same thing in answer to that I'd tell seminarians who you're teaching about the two infancy narratives in the Gospels. I mean, you should know this. You should be a sophisticated, knowledgeable person about the Word of God, the Gospels, the New Testament. But don't preach it in your Christmas sermon, I mean, don't go out there and demythologize for people and call that preaching. So, I give talks on Guadalupe in Spanish and, to more popular audience all the time. And many of the theologians, and I work on the theology of Guadalupe, I didn't really talk about that so much tonight, where I just simply take the apparition narrative as sacred text. It's like the gospel stories. It's loaded with evangelical themes. I wrote a whole book on this. And I just talk about that without even broaching the question. I will never say something like, we have historical evidence for this. I almost always get asked, Professor, have you seen the scientific studies, that you can see Juan Diego in her eyes? And I have seen them, but I say, I'm not a scientist. I really can't conclude. So, as I'm sure you do as well, there are plenty of ways we can, in the proper setting, teach what we know about the New Testament to people who should know about it and be informed and not be naive, and to use those tools, actually, to deepen our understanding of the salvific Word of God that comes through the text. But then when we're talking in other contexts, to just simply talk about the text as theological meaning. And with Guadalupe, it's easy to do the same thing. There's plenty of it's loaded with theological meaning, and you don't have to delve into the things I'm delving to here. It is important to me, as I'm sure it's important to you. There's an historical person called Jesus, and we're not talking about something that's simply made up. And I do believe, I debated when he was still alive, there was a priest, a Vincentian priest from California, who wrote the most important book in English disproving Juan Diego's existence. And I debated him in a very different way than the procurators of the canonization did, using some of the same kind of evidence I have here that, no, we don't have his birth certificate, we don't have his death certificate, but this oral tradition is not based on nothing. There are people who knew about him, who spoke about him, and I absolutely believe, as an historian, that there's a there. We just don't have a lot of details of what the there, all that we'd like to know. The same thing with the Gospels. They weren't written to satisfy the questions of the curious 2,000 years later, but there is a there, And we need to talk about the meaning of the Gospels and the meaning of the Juan Diego Guadalupe encounters for faith today and life today. Thanks. That's very good. Add anything to that?
No, that's super helpful.
Okay, thanks. Well, there was a question from one of our, actually a series of questions about Guadalupe and pastoral ministry, how might this apply? So, I mean, I guess there's lots of ways. One thing, of course, is people love Guadalupe. I think what this very specific thing that I presented tonight, though, it really shows to us the importance of knowing what's going on in the community you serve. Like a lot of times in liturgy, we talk about what the Eucharist means, and we develop a sacramental theology, and that's very, very beautiful. But we also need to know, as I know Professor Gu does in her classes, what's going on in the people who are out there praying. Are they taking in this wonderful idea of what the Eucharist means, and how do we catechize, and how do we understand what it means to them? In the case of Latinos, how do we understand what their popular devotions actually mean to them? What is the underlying theological worldview? And actually, a lot of Latino theologians, this is what they write about. Don't take popular piety as something that only grandmothers do and that therefore is not part of theology. Look at the practices of the people, their posadas, the way of the cross, their Marian devotion, and ask, why are these so powerful in their practice, their minds, their hearts? And what's the underlying, and then how does that feed the way we're going to celebrate Eucharist in such a way that the faith really is coming alive for people? So my study of the indigenous people, I think one of the pastoral implications at least is, how do we know what the people are saying that maybe isn't necessarily, like Juan Diego's our intercessor, is not what the priests and theologians were saying. It's not what the pastors and theologians, it's what the people were discovering on their own. And if we're going to be good pastors, we have to know that. We got to know what's going on with the people and take seriously their theological, spiritual voice so that the gospel becomes an encounter between the pastoral leaders and the people, and not kind of a one-way street of preaching. I think you already knew all of that, but I think this is a really wonderful example of what these native voices can remind us we need to be in our own pastoral work. Maybe we have time for one or two more?
Sure.
Oh man, is it on? Fantastic.
Yeah.
Yes. Hi, I'm Ben. I teach also in liturgy and ethics here. This might be just a really simple question, but I had a curiosity about the intercessory, asking for intercessions that was cited by the initial source that you opened the paper with, and the other folks, the residents at Cuautitlan. Mm-hmm. Is that practice, the indigenous practice of asking for intercessions from Juan Diego, something that was constant? You mentioned that the sources spoke mostly about their aunts, their uncles, these folks. Is it something that declined and then had a resurgence when in later devotion, or is it something that's constant in the indigenous piece, which is related to sort of a second piece of my curiosity, and that is, what relation, if any, did the petitions for intercession of the Spaniards have to, that comes later, as you said, what relation does that have to the indigenous practice? Did it build on it? Did it develop independently? Was there interplay between the two, judgment between the two? How does it go?
I'm not quite sure on the second question.
If the indigenous folks did it first, and then lots and lots of folks do it later.
You mean appeal to Juan Diego as an intercessor?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. What does that interplay look like? Were they independent developments, or did one inform the other?
Okay, thank you. That's very good. To your first question, I don't know, but I think probably the indigenous devotion is not constant. We just don't have the records. These people in 1666 are testifying to what their elders told them about the actual person Juan Diego while he was still alive. And they're saying that they went to him as an intercessor. They don't even indicate a lot that they were still doing it, as you would to a saint who's now in heaven. And then there's long periods in the following centuries where we don't know a lot about what indigenous people are doing, but I don't know of any accounts where they talk about different things, but they don't talk about this continuing turning to Juan Diego. It comes up, actually the first kind of push to canonize Juan Diego doesn't happen until the 20th century, first serious push. After the Cristero Rebellion, there's a brutal war in Mexico between the government and peasants who are defending the church. And at that point, a bishop who's in exile writes a pastoral letter, says we should do this. You begin to see, a greater inclination towards turning to him as intercessor. I don't know that it's necessarily based on the native. I mean, the clergy, they're thinking canonization now in the formal sense of that term. And if someone's going to be canonized, he's also an intercessor. So, it starts to develop that way. They certainly were not drawing on the 1666. I think I'm the first one that ever pointed that out. So it's not something that's been transmitted down through the centuries. Oh, remember when the Indians said this? Most people don't. Those documents were lost for several centuries and have only resurfaced, in the last 50 years or so. So I don't think that had much influence on the clergy that eventually pushed for the canonization. You need to read Austin Cruz's dissertation, because he's going to actually study the whole process of this, and he's doing some great work, some great research. Someone asked in the written questions about the relationship between Our Lady of Guadalupe of Mexico and Our Lady of Guadalupe of Extremadura, because there is a shrine to Our Lady of Guadalupe in Extremadura, Spain. It's been there since the 13th century. Our Lady, it's different. It's a dark image of Our Lady holding the Christ child. Extremadura, Spain is a Theotokos image. It's the Mary, Mother of God image. Our Lady of Guadalupe is an Immaculate Conception image. No Christ child. She's pregnant. And some have said, well, the Guadalupe of Mexico is simply a remanifestation. The Extremadura shrine was very popular in the Reconquista of Mexico. Christopher Columbus was a devotee of Extremadura. Hernan Cortés was, Columbus prayed there before he made his voyages. There's a big monastery, still there to this day. The King and Queen of Spain, that was their primary Marian devotee. So it was a big deal. It was a big deal, and it's centuries before the Guadalupe of Tepeyac. So some people want to say this is derivative. I don't buy it. The images look different for one hand. The stories are different. Guadalupe of Extremadura is a classical Reconquista story. When the Moors came up from Africa and conquered Spain, the Spaniards hid all their holy images, because the Moors, of course, were Muslims. They don't believe in having images of any kind, so they would have destroyed them. So they hid them. And as the Spaniards 700 years later came back down and reconquered the peninsula, there are all these stories of rediscovered images, miraculously preserved and rediscovered. And Guadalupe of Extremadura is one of those miraculous rediscovery stories. But beyond that, there's all kinds of articles and even books about this. So I'm disagreeing with a huge body of literature now that maybe those people would disagree with me if they were standing here. But they point out similarities between the two. They both appeared on a Saturday. The bishop at first didn't believe, appeared to a poor person. All kinds of things that are similar in the stories. To which my answer is, yeah, that's true of all kinds of Marian stories. So the point is not, does Guadalupe of Mexico recapitulate one Spanish miraculous apparition site because they happen to have the same name? Because it appears to me like the place was first named Guadalupe by the Spanish conquerors, and she was the Virgin Mary that appeared at the place they'd named Guadalupe. But Our Lady of Guadalupe doesn't just draw on Extremadura. She draws on literally hundreds, thousands actually, of apparitions that happened in Renaissance and early modern Spain and throughout medieval Europe. Apparitions are an entire genre, a spirituality genre in Catholicism. Every apparition is unique. There's always something that sets, why is Our Lady of Czestochowa different than this other one? But they all draw on a common patrimony. If the person in the apparition doesn't behave like the Virgin Mary, it gets declared to be illegitimate. There's a certain there's a series of coordinates. Sometimes it's on a Saturday. It's almost always to a poor or insignificant person. Her message is, this kind of a message. There's all sorts of, and so there's a whole ensemble of details, and each new manifestation of this spiritual expression of our Catholic faith draws on the whole ensemble and reconfigures them in a new and unique way. Maybe adds certain details. Almost always in the New World, localizes the story in the local people. It's a local person. Mary comes, speaks their language, etc. Lourdes is like that too. Every country in Latin America has got a major national Marian patroness. And so they don't draw on one story of apparition in Spain, which was loaded with these kinds of stories. Every village in Spain had some kind of miraculous something. It draws on the entire patrimony. And I think the comparison of Extremadura to Guadalupe misses the larger point, that it's drawing on an entire Marian tradition in Catholicism, not on one precedent. I had a couple other questions here too, but maybe one more from the crowd if there's anybody that wants to get the final question in. This is it. It's time to let you go.
I actually had a question for you.
Oh, okay.
As I'm listening to you, I'm just wondering, what do you think how do you see the devotion, the images, the popularity, all the stories and history of Our Lady of Guadalupe in the global context? So Latin America, it's still like Western, right? I mean, largely, okay, mestizo, but Western sort of tradition. And so in the global, not even just Catholic Church, but in the sort of like universal Christian, religion, for lack of a better word. How do you see, how can we place Our Lady of Guadalupe in that context?
That's probably the most important question. And I've spent the last 40 years trying to answer it. And I want to say one thing, and I want to tell you a little story to end. My mentor, Father Virgil Elizondo, God rest him, he always used to say, Our Lady of Guadalupe is not important because we theologians study her and write about her. She's important because she lives in the hearts and the minds of the people. And we can look and see there's something deeply, deeply powerful in Our Lady of Guadalupe. And we're trying to catch up and figure out what it is. What is it in her that has impacted so many people? First, indigenous people, Mexican people, Mexicans that now live in the United States, and now the power of their devotion, because it's not just her now, it's the millions of people that follow her. When John Paul goes there, he says, wow, there's something here. What is it? And then he starts the Chapel of Guadalupe in the crypt of St. Peter's. She's right next to the bones of St. Peter. So, I mean, in some ways, your question is the question, but theologians are asking. And the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. There's something extremely powerful here, and we're just scratching the surface of why she is so moving in the lives of people. But here's an experience I had that launched me on the journey to answer that question that you have that I'm never going to be able to answer fully. Years ago, I went to for the first time, San Fernando Cathedral in San Antonio, where I met and married my wife, very important place to me. We went to the Serenata. The night before the Guadalupe feast, December the 12th, you have a serenade. And it's like a serenade you do, to your loved one. When we were dating, I did a serenata. I brought mariachis to my wife's hotel, or apartment, and we sang at her door at 6 o'clock in the morning of her birthday. You do that to Our Lady on her feast day. You have a serenata for her. It's like, it's like a love expression. And even secular singers are invited. They have to sing an appropriate song, but they sing a love song. It might be a popular love song from the radio, but they sing their love to Our Lady. And each one gets to sing one song. It's very moving, very impactful. So you got to go real early. We get there. We got inside the cathedral, and they're singing these songs, and it's very moving. And in the middle of it, the youth of the parish present a proclamation of the apparition story. They act it out, and they do this whole drama. And, I'm sitting there, and I'm watching this, and around me are distinguished people dressed in guayaberas and so on, and a number of working class people in flannel shirts and blue jeans and simple outfits. And I'm watching them as they watch the proclamation of the apparitions, And Juan Diego's kind of walking humped over. He's a humble guy, and he's going to the bishop's house, and the bishop won't let him in, or the sisters won't let him in, and the bishop is doubting, and Juan Diego comes back, and I'm watching these faces on these people around me, and they're kind of, oh, and it's like, man, they're totally identifying with Juan Diego. His pain is their pain, you know? Oh, like, I know what it feels like to have the door slammed in your face, to not be trusted, to be treated, well, you're an immigrant, you're this, you're that, you don't count. And of course, at the very end of it, Juan Diego, whose very bodily gestures have been that of a humiliated man, he's kind of stumped over. At the very end, he's been kneeling before the bishop, having trouble getting to see the bishop. At the end, he drops the roses from his tilma. And for the first time in the entire proclamation, Juan Diego has to stand tall, proud, and he has to stretch out his arms so that the tilma drapes down, and you can see that the image of Our Lady has appeared on the tilma. And at that point, the bishop shouts out, "Milagro! Milagro! It's a miracle!" And the bishop and his entourage kneel before Our Lady, but in kneeling before Our Lady, they also kneel before Juan Diego. And so the entire thing is changed. The powerful are now kneeling before the marginalized. And when that happened, this huge applause erupted in the cathedral, you know, like, oh, everybody's clapping. And, you know, at the time I was sort of thinking, well, yeah, the youth did a wonderful job and everybody knows it's over now, you know, so they're applauding. But the more I thought about it afterwards when I went home that evening, and I've been thinking about it ever since, my reflection was they're not just applauding because the youth did a nice job presenting the apparitions. They're applauding because Guadalupe's story is their story. These people who have suffered great humiliation, you know, immigrants, people who have been put down in many ways, they look at Juan Diego and they, you know, again, people will ask me, do you believe the story of Our Lady of Guadalupe is true? Is that a truth? Did that happen? Is it a true story? And my answer as a theologian, it's the truest story that's ever been spoken on this continent, in this hemisphere. It's the story that of Our Lady saying, the world around you tells you you're nobody. You're no good, you don't count. But I'm going to tell you there's something very, very different in the world of God. Juan Diego, you matter. The Juan Diegos of this world, you matter. And why does Guadalupe live in the hearts and minds of her people? Because she came down and told Juan Diego he matters. And she tells them when they stand before her and gaze into her eyes, you may be suffering. You may not know the solution. You may think, you know, you're going to be deported in the next week. You may think you're going to be separated from your children. You're not alone. Guadalupe, of course, like Christianity itself, is not about solving all of our problems. I mean, 500 years later, one could legitimately ask, is the world really in a better place than it was 500 years ago, or are we still going down? Or 2,000 years since the resurrection of Christ, another anniversary we're about to celebrate. 2,000 years later, is the world better off than we were 2,000 years ago? I mean, that's an open question. Christianity is not a giant aspirin tablet that solves all of our problems. Neither is Guadalupe. The Mexican people have suffered. They continue to suffer. But for 500 years, they've never suffered alone. They've always had a mother who accompanies and gives them hope. And why does she spread? I don't know, but that's what I've seen. She gives hope to people who otherwise have no one else to turn to. She's the one that stands by them. And I presume that's going to keep happening for many more years to come. And maybe one day we'll get a theologian that can give a proper answer to your question. That's all I got to offer. Thank you so much.
Well, friends, thank you for gathering here tonight. Thank you, Tim, for your just rich, just wonderful research that you're presenting to us tonight, and we're all very much indebted and with your insight. So thank you so much. Please help yourself to a little bit more sandwiches or anything that you would like, and thank you, and we'll see you at the next event. Thank you.